Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
To support decision and policy making. And I thought I'd start out this morning by getting some feedback from you, first of all. How many of you are aware of and had any involvement in the discussions going around the global framework for climate services? Very few, one or two or three. Did any of you happen to have a chance to review the high-level task force's document that just came out and is now closed for review? Did any of the three of you that I saw, you saw it, did you, Tim? Okay. It's quite interesting. I found it very interesting to read that. I found it very encouraging in one or two places and very upsetting in a number of other places. And I'd encourage you to look at that, because a lot of the discussions, a lot of things that we're discussing, I'll be discussing, but some of the discussions I heard at the end of yesterday were related to things that are being considered within that global framework. And this is a response of the UN, primarily WMO, to look at how we can better support decision-making using climate information. And it's very revealing to look at some of the way it's being presented. And I do encourage you to look at that if you get a chance. The document, I think the new one will be out and will be considered at WMO Congress, the next Congress. So we should see something in the April time period. So if you get a chance, do take a look at that, because this is people deciding how, to a certain degree, how they're going to use the information that you are generating to support decision making. If you think it from that perspective, it is an important document to look at. But what I'm going to talk about today is the experiences we have had using climate information. And one of the things, I'm going to start with my conclusions. And these are some of the conclusions that I have from our experience. And the first thing to remember, information is that is needed to support decisions. I mean, it becomes obvious. It's an obvious conclusion that comes out of that. And really, descriptions of the current and future climate are necessary, but they're really insufficient. They are insufficient. You cannot, there's very few decisions that you can make with just descriptions of the climate. And what we really have to consider is this whole idea of trying to understand what that decision is, and therefore what information is needed to support it. And we start to look at things like vulnerabilities, sensitivities, thresholds. Understanding those things is useful. It's a start. It's a start. Sustained and informed engagement of both users and providers. And Dave Sexton and some of the other people have been involved in this. And I think David will be one of the first. I've actually heard you say that. You've learned a lot through that sustained engagement, that engagement with the users. And the users are actually starting to ask better questions. So it's really important. I think they are. David, you think they are too? At some of them. It does change the way. And if that's what you're trying to do, I'm also a very strong believer that we need to invest in climate science to better understand the climate system and what's going on. If we don't do that, we're lost. But if we only do that, and when you're trying to support decisions, we're also lost. So we have to really look at that. So this sustained and informed engagement is really important. And what we're seeing is it's a continuous improvement idea. You know, the user's needs are better understand, the science capabilities are better understand, and this dynamic nature of trying to balance this demand and supply for information. I've got some really horror stories of things that I've seen that researchers are doing and consultants are doing with climate information. They're drawing lines on very high resolution city maps and saying these backyards are going to have problems, but these ones won't. And it really gets scary. It really gets scary. But I'm seeing less and less of that being done. Both access and support are necessary. Making climate information available and accessible is really necessary, but insufficient. We're at the point now where we can take a jug full of climate science and climate projections and start pouring it, and it'll never stop. It's good, but it's not all it's not sufficient. And one product and approach does not fit all. The single snapshot and making that available and updating it every 5 years, you know, it's really insufficient. And that's because there's a lot happening. It's not just one person or one group that's now making this information available. There's a number of them making it available. And we have to be able to bring that out in, but also the community, the demand, the capacity to pick up this information is changing very rapidly. Okay. Let's go into little bits and pieces of this now a little bit deeper. The thing for needed for information support is changing. What it really is looking at is that we're moving past the point where we have to only prove that the climate is changing. There's a need for action, and it's not just mitigation, it's adaptation. And there's a need for action. We're having to deal with that now. We already have a significant adaptation deficit in this country, and I would suggest around the globe. So we have to start dealing with that. And that means we have to move from simply identifying adaptation options. And I'll go on to explain that one a little bit more in detail. But we have to move beyond that, just identifying adaptation options. And that takes a different type of climate information when you're trying to do that. One of the things that you start to realize is that in having discussions with people about adaptation is very complex. And when you sit with a bunch of tech engineers, they'll sit there and they'll come up with all the technical and structural changes that need to be made. And they fail to realize in a lot of cases that there's the non-technical and non-structural requirements and adaptation options that actually allow you to implement those technical and structural changes. A water company, we'll change this, we'll put in this new procedure, and then someone will say, wait, we have to train our staff a little bit differently. And then we got all these health and safety rules. Then we'll have to make the people aware that are using the water and live around the piece of kit that we're placing in to resolve the problem of all the potential implications and what that'll mean to them, and it just goes on and on and on. So you recognize that there's not only the technical and structural, but there's the non-technical, non-structural, and getting in the strategic and policy areas. And those are the ones that are putting in the regulations that need to be there. So you need to recognize that. This is a key one. This one here, the need for a balance. And this gets into that point I was making about drawing lines through people's backyards or gardens or whatever, and that. And just looking at it is just really, really difficult. And making people aware of that we cannot give them certain things from the providers, letting them know that and having a discussion. And often you find out maybe you can give them something else that actually they can still make the decision using that information. So it's getting that balance. And I know David has had this people want something and you can't necessarily give it to them. And you tell them that, but then you have that dialogue. You can actually find that there is something that you can use to help inform that decision. And it's not just about climate change throughout the century. Lord Adair sits on 50, he's the chair of the Climate Change Committee, sits on 50 boards, major companies around the world. And he will be the first to tell you that very, very few of them talk anything beyond 3 to 4 years. That's the bulk of the decisions. They need to know what's going on. They need to know what's going on now. They'd love to get what's going on in the near term. So there's a major challenge to the climate science community as far as adaptation is concerned. What's that gap between today and the next 3 to 5 years or 10 years? They also need to know what goes beyond that, because there's some major infrastructure investments where you do need to have a lot more information. But what we're also finding out is that adaptation of major infrastructure has some flexibility. And what that means, it's a challenge to designers. Technical Strategies Board here in the UK is now invested £2.5 million in looking at how they can adapt buildings in this country. I think there was 26 buildings that recently won a competition. And they're going to look at how they can adapt those buildings over the longer term to a changing climate. The next competition comes out in the summer coming up, and there'll be another £2.5 million put into investing. Each one gets about 100,000. So they're really looking at that, how they're going to do that. And the 100,000 is just to think about the designing of that building. And also this last point here is really trying to understand, and this is something we struggle a lot with, is it's really trying to understand how you present information that also recognizes the capacities of the users. Government, in a lot of cases, people are in a position for 2 years. Last year they did, and I joked with David on this, last year they were looking at dung beetles. And this year they're looking at climate change. And next year, 2 years from now, they'll be doing something else completely different. So these are the people that are writing policy. These are the people that are developing that. How do you get information that can inform them so that they can actually put together something that is viable? And that's a difficult situation. Information needed, I already talked about this, consistent with thresholds and sensitivities, defined by users, but consistent with the science, that's that balance. Key words that I often use are decision and policy relevant. And trying to understand that is really difficult. It's a significant challenge as far as I'm concerned in research, particularly when getting to impacts. People want to know, well, what's droughts going to be like? How are we going to experience these different types of things? So impacts, and trying to take the climate information and develop impacts and communicate that uncertainty is very, very important. It's often, as I said, it's not the traditional values, it's derived climatologies and statistics, both past, present, and trends. Any information that people can pull in is really important. This is becoming a big issue. It's starting to become, as people are starting to implement things, implement adaptation options, or go beyond just identifying them. They now want to, sort of appraise them. Which ones am I going to put in place? Which series of adaptation options do I put into place? Which package of adaptations options do I put in place? And how do I prioritize those? It's a really difficult thing to prioritize adaptation options. You have to think about things such as flexibility, robustness, effectiveness, urgency, cost. Cost-benefit analysis as it's traditionally done is not an effective way for adaptation, because there's so much, the deep uncertainty that is there doesn't lend itself to CBA. There's a lot of work now that's starting to go on how you understand doing costs, how you do this appraisal. And CBA keeps trying to edge its way in, and they're trying to develop different ways of doing this. But it's also, when you get into this evaluation, you've implemented on options, the information that you need for that is, again, quite different than it was to actually do an impact assessment or vulnerability assessment. In fact, if you're trying to do a vulnerability assessment, you have to remember that there's 57, I only thought there was 54, we found 3 more, legitimate definitions of vulnerability. They're legitimate, they're in different areas. You talk to vulnerability, I bet you there's people around here that have different concepts in their mind and uses of the term vulnerability. There's over 15 definitions of resilience. So you say I'm going to reduce resilience, it means something different to a whole bunch of other people than it does to you probably. So how do you then deal with that whole issue of providing information to enhance resilience when someone else has a completely different idea of what that means than you do? So it's this decision relevant that's important. Who are the users that we're seeing? Does this show up? Oh, it's not too bad. It's quite interesting to see how this is evolving. And there's many reasons for that. And this will be different. This is based on something that came out September this year. This is all based on September of this year. So it may have changed a little bit too. But there's many drivers of who's using this and determinants of who's using this type of information. And it is more than researchers. Up until 2000, maybe 2002, it was primarily researchers that were using it. You had a couple people that were really interested and they fooled around with it. But now if you look at this, researchers is this part. People that identify themselves as researchers is that part. Who are using it? Public sector and local authorities. But why? You start to think of that. Why is that happening? They now have a statutory obligation to use it. So they have to use this information. These people are actually having to use it. We've got in the Climate Change Act here in the UK, or in England and Wales, and the similar up in Scotland, there are requirements that they carry out a risk assessment and identify adaptation options. It's called the reporting powers. There's 40,000 organizations that are having to do this. Right now we're targeting 100, and I think there's 20 more that are being targeted by the government, and some people are volunteering to do it. They're having to do that, so it's putting a lot of pressure on them to use this. The other one is there's National Indicator 188, which was required by local authorities to them to do an assessment. And it's not a statutory requirement, but it's a competition. What we found out is Norwich has done it. Wow, Cambridge, I can do one. We can do it better than they can. And then next thing you got Peterborough. Well, we'll go do better than Norwich. And you got this competition going on with all these local authorities trying to do better than the other person in being, I'm a level 5. No, but I'm a level 6. You know, and they have competitions, and it's quite interesting. But what it means is they're all, number of them, up until they now have gotten rid of NY 188 because the government doesn't believe in performance indicators, this government. But anyways, a number of them were hiring climate adaptation officers in local authorities. There's a significant number of them, and they're actually having to go and use this. And this shows what they were using it for, and it doesn't show up well there. It'll be there, but a quarter of people are, even though they're not doing research, they're not researchers, they're doing research. But that means some of the consultancies are then starting to come in. So it's about a quarter of those that are doing that. A lot are still doing it to increase awareness. So it's understanding that awareness is this one, sorry. Colors are different up in there than over here. Anyways, it's really interesting. Why are they using the information? That means they need different types of information for why they're using it. So if you think of all the capacities things, etc. I've already gone through that. Okay. Some of the things that are quite interesting is there's different approaches that have been around for when you're doing adaptation. This one here, we call it predict, optimize, and relax. And it's based on the old concept, you have to adapt. Done it, move on. Don't have to do that anymore. And this is what was around and it's often interpreted as the IPCC 7 steps. It's what was around when we first started off. It's what the IPCC recommended up until about 1995 or 96, somewhere in there. And it's a very linear model, and you spend all your time. And what happened is, everybody spent all their time and money trying to get the climate right, and then, we said we were going to do adaptation. Okay, let's think about it. Well, we could do this, and that's all they did. That's all they had time for. Very little time to spend on actually doing an adaptation. And the whole focus was on getting the climate right, and it's because there was so much uncertainty, it stopped people from making decisions and actually doing anything. Great impact assessments. Phenomenal piece of research that was done. But it's a very linear model, and people are realizing it has limited applicability when you're trying to actually do adaptation. This is one, I'm going to go through two of these, but this is one, and this is the one that we've been working with, and this is just one model, but a number of other people around the world are moving to this now. And it's really starting to, what you're trying to do is focusing on understanding the risks that are associated with the particular system of interest. That's your focus. And you understand not only the climate risk, but all the other drivers. Because what we're finding when we walk into people come to us and says, we want to do a risk assessment on climate change. And okay, we talk to them, and after a while, you realize that climate is a really small component of their major risks. And it's bringing in that understanding and allowing them to do this mainstreaming of adaptation to climate change with the other things that is what this type of approach allows. But it also, this approach allows you to recognize that maybe everything isn't right today. We've got a major problem. We have adaptation deficits. We went into one company and they said, oh, we don't have a problem, no problems, no problem. They came to us, we didn't come to them. And we got talking to them, and we just, after one of the guys says, well, we do have, every once in a while, we don't get our supplies in from the southwest. Well, I can't figure, we don't know what's causing it. And then we talked a little bit more and realized their supplies come along that train line that goes around Dorset, gets washed out every time there's a heavy rain. And so what they have to do is now look at, rather than just in time, what are some of the approaches that they can take to get their materials in. It follows this recursive model where it's a continuous learning and improvement idea. And what I really like about it, it allows you to start to, and I use the word embrace the uncertainty rather than use it as a reason for not doing anything. You bring it in. You bring the uncertainty in and you start to use it in terms of trying to inform the decisions that you're willing to take, because it allows you to then decide, how much risk am I willing to take that I'm wrong? How much do I have to be right? I did an exercise with a number of people in the water companies. It was quite interesting. They don't take any risks. You know, I used cards and stuff like this. It's a really interesting way of looking at how people approach uncertainty. And boy, every time there was any problems, they went over to one side and says, nope, we're going to take the full action that we need to take, regardless of whether the risk was high or not. They're going to do it. Whereas other people have different views of risk and how much risk they're willing to tolerate. But what this also allows you to do, because it's continuous improvement, allows you to adjustment. So it gets into this idea that adaptation is also a manner of doing something right today, getting a little bit done for tomorrow, and then adjusting it as the uncertainty becomes less or the options become more available and the tolerances for risk change. Robust is the other one. Robust is the other approach, and this is often touted as the way to go, and a number of companies are starting to use this whole idea. And what you do is because the uncertainty and vulnerabilities are high, is that you identify options that perform well no matter what happens. So you look at the widest range, and you set everything, okay, I'm going to do everything to make sure nothing happens in that area. Nothing will happen, so you want to know the boundaries, and both now and in the future. Starts with lower reps. You're looking at flexible and open-ended adaptation options that allow you to adjust as time is going on. Again, if you think about that from a climate information perspective, what information do they need? It's quite different than the information for all the other ones as well. The other thing that's become very obvious to us is not all users need projections data. I mean, we've run some very successful activities by just going in and talking about warmer, wetter winters. It's been very useful. They made a decision that they had to make. It was sufficient to support that decision. They don't all need it. There's a lot of people just need historical information. Sorry, this is a little out of order. I've got to fix this. I forgot to do it. But these are some of the key findings. The warmer, wetter winters. Summer mean daily maximum temperatures projected to increase from 4.8 to 8.4. My threshold is an increase of 4.6. Do I have to do something? Yes. It'd be a good idea unless you're not willing to accept the risk. There's a risk. My threshold is 9.6 degrees Celsius. Maybe I could be a little cautious and hold off for a bit and get a better understanding. Keep monitoring the situation. There's a projected twofold increase in the frequency of summer droughts by the 2050s. Maybe I really have to look at that. Before the 2050s, we got a replacement of all the drainage systems in the city of Glasgow. Maybe I better do something before, in that time, because I'm going to replace them all. It's a cheaper way to do it. I can replace them all, and that's going to happen in the 2030s. So I'm going to do that. But in the meantime, I'm going to have to put some contingency plans into place. These are some decisions that people are starting to make based on just that type of information. What has to be behind all of these is all the understanding of the consequence and the climate. It has to be there to make it rational, to rationalize it. But you can make the decision based on those words. And we're seeing people actually doing that. Maps, really interesting. This is a historical map. I think it's the you can never see on that one. It's the 71 to 2000 changes in temperature. Quite interesting. I'll come back to this map in a bit. You can get some really interesting information from those types of maps. You can get, does it show up well? These are plume plots, we call them, or they're not quite plumes, but they're line plots, where you have the different 30-year periods along here. You've got different probability levels coming from 09 and change in maximum temperature, and I believe it's the summer. You can look at that and say my threshold is a 2.4 degrees Celsius rise, or between 2 and 4 maybe is a better way of looking at it. 2 and 3 I should say. And you come across here and say I need to really start worrying about that now because it's already a high probability or high risk of that occurrence is being projected. And so I have to really be concerned about that. Or maybe I don't if I'm outside that. But what it allows you to do is focus your analysis on a particular area. So you can select the climate information that is required, and then you can start to focus your analysis and your adaptation strategies in its full development, recognizing the uncertainty that's in that and leading up to it and seeing how it fits within your various investment styles. The major concern, and the reason why I like this type of thing where you offer alternative ways of looking at things, because I don't know how many calls I've had where someone is deep inside the data, terabytes of information in front of them, and they've spent all this time, and they've called me and says, I'm a little bit confused, how do I use this? And I say, just a second, what are you trying to do? What's your major concern? But people get mesmerized by all these numbers and pictures and everything, and they want to get terabytes of information. Can I download UK CP09 onto my laptop? You know, that's what they want to do. And I'm saying, whoa, what do you really want? And it's trying to have that discussion with them, understanding so they don't get mesmerized by the numbers. Sorry. Engaging the providers and users is a major focus and a major thing that I think that is really interesting. Who are the providers? There's meteorological and hydrological services, Met Office, for example. There's KMI, depending on which country you're involved in. IPCC data distribution center. That's the LINK program here in the UK. You can get information from around the world. They're providing that information. Number of universities, some of you guys have information that's available. Make that available. Various international organizations and institutions. USAID. Now go on there, you can get beautiful information from all over the world. You can get a nice map, a globe that rotates. You can look at the different projections. It's really beautiful, some of the things that are going on. National regional facilities, we're starting to see. One of those could be ensembles, for example. It's a regional facility. It's making information available. All that information is available. But what we're finding is that, as I said earlier, availability and accessibility is insufficient. But also there's a need for this engagement, and consultations doesn't do it. It's part, but it doesn't do it. And that's that informed and sustained engagement throughout the entire process of actually development of the climate information, but also through how you disseminate it, how you provide support, and then this continuous improvement. David and people in the Met Office, UEA, and Newcastle, we've been involved significantly and tried to involve the users, and they came up with the things that they said, could you do this for us? And we thought about it. Some we said no, some we wish you'd said no. But other things, hey, hadn't thought of that. Maybe that is quite useful. One of those examples that I thought was great. It was relatively simple to do, and that's people were saying, well, if we have a 2 degrees Celsius global rise, temperature rise, what's that mean for the UK? What's it look like? What's UK CP09 look like for the UK? It's quite interesting, I thought. And a lot of people are starting to use those maps. We've made maps available. You can go on and see for 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we couldn't go any higher because we ran out of projections. There wasn't enough information. Yeah, just wouldn't do it. But people find that really valuable. And so that's something they asked for. They asked for some other things that were a little bit harder than that to do, but I thought it was still really good, some of this information. So it's recognizing that you have to continuously improve the information that's out there to make it more and more decision relevant and easier to use. That you put out the information, and if you just put it out and leave it, it's not bad, but it's actually trying to improve it. But plus, when you do something like we did in UK CP09 and you're making new information available, is that you should be trying to improve it. You can't decide everything on the day you launch it. And so we found that quite useful in trying to do that. Some of the ways that we're doing that, we're continually trying to understand this, and we have a users advisory panel, and that users advisory panel it's been around since we started back in 2000, well, since I came over in 2006, and the representatives have changed a lot, but the providers are there, the users are there. We have great discussions, I think, sometimes. Sometimes there are difficult discussions, but they really have helped us in terms of understanding the enhancements and extras. I found it quite useful. Communities of users is something that we're also exploring, and that's an idea where you actually, some of the users panels, they're not really the users, they're sort of representatives of the users, but then the community of users are actually people using it, and we had a couple, one of them wasn't too bad, the other one, another one, a couple of the other ones have been really useful. We've got one that is focusing on the use of the weather generator, for example. So people that are using the weather generator, getting together and exploring that and looking at and learning from each other. The marine projections. We're starting to get that community together. It's a brand new community. They really want to get at that. But what we're also finding is that having the experts there, the providers, and the expert users is really instructive, and they're learning from each other on that. They're actually all starting to get together by themselves, which is really scary. All the users, or the users and the providers, are getting together without us involved, but I find that quite useful. Guidance, really, we're exploring how to do this. This is brand new way of doing things, providing guidance. And again, it evolves as we go along. We can't think of every way people are going to use things, so I can't provide guidance on everything, but every time we learn something, it's very useful, and it's helpful. Case studies, part of the guidance. These are quite interesting. We would really like to have case studies of how not to use UK CP09, but we can't get anyone to volunteer to write them for us. Oh, Peter, you did it the wrong way. Do you want to mind putting a case study together? I could just imagine how you would love to do that with your name right down at the bottom. But those are really helpful, and they are trying to demonstrate, and we're getting better at putting those case studies together. Feedback mechanism has been useful. Online feedback opportunities, help desk. One of the things that we're finding now is that users are, because of this current government situation and the cutback, it's getting more and more difficult to get users to actually come to face-to-face meetings. We're having difficulty. The one we did up in Birmingham the other week, we didn't get as many users as we wanted there. And we're realizing, they all wanted to be there, but they all said, well, they won't even let me get a bus ticket to the other end of town, let alone come up to a meeting in Birmingham. So we have to now look at other things. And so we're starting to look at this online forum. We're starting to look at e-learning and webinars a lot more and try and make those things available. And also we do work with users in terms of their assessment processes. So we're one-to-one going with them and working with them. This has had some considerable positive impacts. It's recognized. People see this as providing information, and there's still a lot of pressure on us. I mean, David's been trying to write the papers for a number of months, years. I wasn't going to say it, I was waiting for you. But we're trying to write those papers, but there's a lot of pressure to try and improve this information. But we're recognized as trying to do that. I don't know how many visitors every year coming over trying to figure out, from all over the world, trying to figure out how we do this. Because they're recognized as UK is so far ahead of everyone else in pushing this, and we have to continue to do that. User buy-in is a big issue. Users are actually bought into this. Some of them didn't know what they were buying into. Some of them are, still having problems, but they are at least coming back to the shop. They're coming back to the shop. So there is that buy-in there. There are doing case studies. We'd love more, but we're starting to get more and more doing them. A lot of people are holding off till they see another one that's done, because then they don't want to be that one that we put up as maybe that's a bad one that we don't want to do. So they want to be reassured. The better understanding of what can and cannot be delivered and how climate information can and cannot be used. And there is desire by both the users and providers to sustain this. They want to be involved. They want to do this because they see benefits. So it's a big issue. Some of the challenges, I've just got 3 more slides. Some of the challenges, dealing with uncertainty is still a big thing, we keep trying to tell people, observations have significant amount of uncertainty associated with them when you're trying to do adaptation. The fact that Heathrow is seen as describing London's climate in some number of cases, there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that. It's not even the other end of the runway is it valid, let alone for London. So, and there's other reasons why observations have uncertainty, and so does the future have uncertainty. People believe because it's an observation, it's reality, and it can apply everywhere. So how do we communicate that? And I've said this over and over again so that you can inform decisions, and we need to spend a lot more effort on trying to decide that. Optimal adaptation. Optimal adaptation is often referred to as is defined by cost-benefit analysis. And actually, we're not going to be able to do that because we cannot afford to do the high benefits that we'll need, and the costs will vary so widely. So what you need to do, and the uncertainty is so high, so what we need to do is define that optimal a lot differently than we used to. We need to find out how we can do it in a way to deliver as much protection as we can, but also in a way that we can have in place mechanisms to deal with when we fail. Because we will always fail. We will be people we cannot protect for a number of reasons. Desire for a single set of information. I mean, we're going through this right now. People want, give me the number. Don't give me 10,000 projections for one variable. Give me the number. I use 42. It works not too bad. It used to be 57. So we're trying to look at that. And a lot of that is related to cost in terms of time and capacity. Their inability to interpret the outputs is when it's just descriptions of climate, and some people find it very difficult to use. But we're seeing innovations now, some significant innovations that I think that are. I'm really optimistic. But a lot of this raises these questions: how do we better support these users? But also raises this other question: who owns the risk? If you give them the number, you own the risk. You are the one that's got, if they say, wasn't me, it was Peter. He gave me that number. So he's the one that owns the risk. It's not my fault. That's what people want to do. They want to move the risk to somebody else. And so we're trying to deal with that problem. And then it's it gives you an example here. This is probably a change being less than a particular, as projected, less than a particular value. And this is change in summer mean temperature. And UK SIPO 2, as just an example, was in this gave you a value of 3.8 something like that. Whereas UK CPO 9, this is the PDF or CDF that you see, and you can see how that fits in there. So if you were to design to that one, which is the single number, which is really great, then what you're saying is that here's the central estimate is 4.7. So you may not be covering enough of your risk and being blind to the risks that are actually there. So it's trying to understand that. Couple other challenges. I mean, this is obvious one to you, that first one there. High resolution means high accuracy, doesn't it? I can draw these nice little maps with 1 kilometer grid squares, and I get, beautiful, beautiful colors, and they really look pretty. This is an observational one here, by the way, not a projection. And people say, well, geez, my backyard is right here, so that's where I have the problem. Or I don't. My neighbor next door does. I'm fine. Hence accessibility. That goes back to this. Websites are great, everything's great, but the people just get mesmerized by the numbers. They go straight to the climate data and say, well, the answer's here. We got a call from the people down in Pembrokeshire, and they were trying to understand the marine reserve, I think it is, that's down in there, and they wanted the answers. And the UK CPO 9 was out. They said, send it down to us. And we sort of told them what we couldn't send it down, the things they had to do. And about two or 3 weeks later, we get a call back. The answers aren't here. There's no answers in here. And so we talked it over with them, and they all of a sudden realized they didn't understand any thresholds, any sensitivities of their systems, the species, the habitats that they were dealing with. What UK CPO 9 told them was, though, the research that needed to be done, that they had to learn about those thresholds, they had to learn about those sensitivities. So it was successful in that it alerted them things that they need to know. And what often we're hearing is that from policy and decision makers, is climate information, they're expecting it to tell them the impacts and the consequences. It doesn't. And I even had a piece of paper come across my desk last Monday, and it was saying that UK CPO 9 provided the evidence that natural ecosystems in this country are at significant risk. And I said, no, it doesn't. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't say what's going to happen to the natural ecosystem. It provides you information that can inform those types of descriptions, but there's no evidence buried in that. And the other problem we're having, a challenge, is that people, I don't need guidance, I know everything. So they go in straight away and right into the data again without reading the guidance, and then they do something and they can't figure out why it's caused problems. Challenges ahead. Continue to support evolving user and provider community. There will be different users, significant different users. This localism agenda, this big society agenda in this country are going to change that users again, significantly change them. We're already starting to see that. But also what we're seeing is that the provider community is changing very dramatically. Available climate information and analytical capacities are significant. Things we couldn't do a year ago, we can do now. I mean, computer power will increase maybe we'll get access to a more powerful computer. We don't know what the economic situation is going to do, but that'll all change. It's all changing. These suggest that a single periodic snapshot is no longer sufficient. This idea of putting out something every 5 years or 10 years is no longer sufficient. We have to be able to provide some type of framework to allow the information that comes in as it's needed, but also, as it's available, I should say, but also being able to recognize that we have to support different users and types of users and these evolving users all the time. And that calls for additional enhanced analytical tools, different types of presentations, introduction of new climate information that comes out from different places, and then enhanced capability to extract decision-relevant information from the available outputs. That requires, and I think it was Michael and I that were having the discussions, that there's actually a missing group of people. I mean, there's that need to be able to do that. UK-SIP tries to do that, but I don't think UK-SIP is even the right group of people. It's a different type, and it's a different type of people that are needed. And I think we need to think about that a lot. I've already gone through most of this. This is my last slide. More effective ways of engaging users, encouraging sharing of experience and partnerships, and broadening that community of the providers that are actually engaged. We have some very brilliant people here in the UK, in the modeling community, in the analytical community, and we have to be able to bring them in. We can't stifle people and hold them out. And I think we need to figure ways of doing that as well. So those are my 4 key messages that I started with, and that's the end. Thank you. Just because I picked on you, Peter.
As time goes on, we're going to refine and change the climate projections and the uncertainties about those projections. And it's possible that those uncertainties are going to get larger.
I think it's highly possible.
Yeah. As we do stuff. How are the users going to cope with that? Can they cope with that?
My answer to that question is a number of them will be able to, because we've already had that discussions with them about that. Because they're engaged, because they're informed. I mean, I think I've heard David and James both say that in meetings where we've had users there. Unfortunately, there was only 10 or 20 of them, but that information is much more easy to take in as if they're informed and engaged in that discussion. It'll continue to be difficult. It will continue to be difficult to do that. But I think if we could come up with better ways of actually communicating that, the implication of that uncertainty to the decisions that they're making, that's where the real effort is going to, the benefits are going to be.
I'll just follow up on that. As an end user, there's a fear or a risk that we ignore the uncertainty. Yeah. And so we actually make definitive statements which we decide are correct because the uncertainty is so great, and that's the real risk. And I think that's the challenge, is communicating this uncertainty in a way that doesn't limit those people from making decisions. But we can't do that, and that's, well, I'll be talking about this in a minute, but that's so important that we understand what uncertainty means and that we have a way to communicate with the experts who understand it. And that's, for us, from the NGO community, that's not there at the moment.
It's not there, and I think, and again, I go back to this sustained engagement and inform, because if we try to do it, if the climate science community tries to do that by itself, I think we will continue to be struggling. I think it's very capable of doing that. I actually introduced another science, and I was very pleased to hear you almost mentioned it, climate change science, which is different than climate science. Is I actually will talk about adaptation science. I know I may get a lot of people upset about that, but I believe that is a different type of science that's needed. But you do need decision makers involved in that dialogue of how you communicate it. It's so important. I saw something here, Michael, and then over there, sorry. Sorry, you should be doing this. I
I
will.
don't know. Chris, just got a question.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
I was wondering whether
Chris, Tim, Michael, a brief comment.
I was wondering whether you've encountered any decision makers, particularly in government, who make use of real options thinking that's developed by
Yes.
finance people to evaluate projects in a much more realistic way than traditional cost-benefit and net present value methods work. And I wondered too if you have encountered any who explicitly make use of risk-averse loss or utility functions so that they properly account for the effects of uncertainty in their decisions.
The Green Book. Do you happen to know what the Treasury Green Book is? Okay, in the UK, the Treasury has a Green Book, which is all the methodologies that support analysis that are associated with investments. There is a supplementary guidance that does talk about option theory, etc. So exactly what you're talking about. It is in there. I'm a little bit more impressed with something I've just seen recently that came out of Australia. And they were looking at making decisions on investments in the built environment, particularly buildings. And they were looking at for new buildings and retrofit. And they explored a number of different ways of looking at it from an economic decision-making perspective. And they started to look at things like second moments. And the way, rather than getting into the, I'm really dangerous when I start talking economics, so I apologize if I'm insulting anyone's intelligence here or anyone's research. But they really started to look at this and saw it as a better way of doing that type of assessment rather than traditional cost benefit. And if you're interested in the paper, I will, if anyone is, just talk to me today and I'll send it to you. But the Green Book does mention that, and that's what they're suggesting. Whether people are doing it, I can only tell you what they're suggesting.
I just wanted to make a quick comment. Well, first of all, just to say I think the work you're doing here is fantastically important.
Thank you. That means the comment's going to be really tough, I know. Thank you for that, Tim. Next question.
It's probably not something you'll disagree with. No, I mean, seriously, first of all, I think this is really important because engaging users in the process of decision-making under extreme uncertainty is something that's got to be done. And I think UK CPO 9 provides a good first step in that direction, providing kind of quantitative data sets. But just coming back to you said right at the beginning, you talked about the WMO Global Climate Service Framework. I mean, I reviewed an early draft of that, and I actually didn't review the second draft because I thought my blood pressure would get too high if I ever read the second draft.
You should have been on the train when I was doing it.
Yeah, and the problem is there is absolutely no recognition in these documents about, it's a point you actually made, about the science, to actually optimize, our ability to provide something useful to users. The science has to be put in first place. And I have the horrible feeling all these WMO member states are just seeing this as a big opportunity to leap on the gravy train. We can do it. 2 to 10 years, no problem.
They want to fill this.
Yeah.
That's what it's a lot about.
Yeah, 2 to 10 years, we'll do it.
Not my wallet, theirs.
And I think, I despair at these documents which make absolutely no reference to the underlying science and the problems we are trying to deal with, to improve these types of predictions. So, you're doing a great job, but we have a long way to go. I think, yes. Especially on these timescales you're talking about, these kind of near decadal timescales. We're at an extremely early stage, and the models are still extremely biased.
Oh, yes.
And there's a lot to be done. It's as simple as that. So, I think WMO have done an appallingly bad job, given all the work leading up to the World Climate Conference and what could have been achieved for the benefit of science.
Yeah.
I'm just venting off, not at you, but
no, I know. No, it's okay. I feel much better now. I thought you were. No, one thing when I read the document, and a lot of it, what the document did look like they were trying too much to do is to solve all the woes associated with climate information through this, and you cannot do that. I really hope that gets straightened out. And I was talking after I sent in my review comments. I met someone that was actually reviewing the document and updating it, and I have a little bit more confidence, but I'm not too sure. sort of an optimist. Anyway. Michael.
Yeah, so I thought that one of the key questions you had was the one where you said, who owns the risk?
Yeah.
So you said, well, if Peter said a number, does he now own the risk? Okay. And I think this is partly the danger here, is this whole notion of uncertainty floats around as a thing,
Yes.
and that Peter just told you what the uncertainty was. But an uncertainty, as I said when I talked about, and I think it was saying to everybody, isn't a thing, it's a judgment that we have.
Yes.
I am uncertain about something, you're uncertain about something, okay? If we were all sitting around in a room, okay, and there was a climate scientist and somebody else, okay, and you just asked the climate scientist, what's your opinion? And they gave you the opinion. You say, are you sure that opinion is right? That would be an absurd question. It's my opinion. You know? So I think the danger is confounding the opinion of somebody with a true thing.
Yes.
And there's a double danger if it's not even your opinion. Because these things, a UK SIP was a wonderful thing, but it did a whole bunch of calculations. It was never clear to me whether it was even the opinions of anybody. So I think there's the danger of misrepresenting something that people want to think is a thing, which is really a judgment, and the judgment obviously is fragile.
Yeah. It is, and it's judgment. What's interesting, and I raised a little bit of this yesterday afternoon, is that climate science will never be the basis of a decision. It will inform a decision, and often a decision is based on a number of other things that are potentially even more important. Politics. If you look at what's going on in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the big thing that everyone's trying to do is to prove that they are the most vulnerable. We're the most vulnerable, and the whole reason for that is that people want to be the most vulnerable, because if they recognize that, they'll get more money to deal with the issues and the development things that they're trying to deal with. But the uncertainty and the risks are something that we have to understand that comes into play. And it's very obvious to me that your tolerance of risk as an individual, if you really think about it, changes very quickly and very well, depending on where you are, who you are, and what time of the day it is, and whether where you were in the last 2 weeks, and all that. So those things all change, and therefore your perception of uncertainty and how you deal with that uncertainty has to be as dynamic as that, at least. So I agree with you on that. I think it is difficult, and it's not all Peter's fault.
Well, he might have made a bad judgment.
He might have. But we know Peter never makes bad judgments. He invited you to a meeting, so how could that be bad judgment? He actually invited me once too, or twice.
Any more discussion? No. Yes.
I'd just like to make a comment, if I may.
Yes?
One thing that we have to be very careful about is being precise, not so much in our science, but in our expressions. Well, we may have, but I mean, the uncertainty is, but for example, you asked, how many people have had a chance to read the recent climate services paper?
Yes.
And remember I put up my hand sort of tentatively?
Tentatively, yes, I saw that.
Well, there was another one. And, in the United States, which is now forming a climate services.
I've actually read that one too.
Yes, but I didn't know which one you were talking about.
It's all right. That's very good. Very good point.
I would like to just point out that we, as people who are communicating with the public, have to be very clear in what we are asking and stating.
Very good. I think that is a really important thing to understand. And as I said, there are 57 definitions, and if you want the paper, I can send it to you. 57 definitions of vulnerability, and I've been in a number of meetings where you'll be discussing vulnerability, and it's only partway through that meeting, and I was sitting in Washington, and we're having a meeting with the health community. And it was halfway through this first day that we finally recognized that we were talking to different things, completely different things. And once we resolved that issue and had an understanding, we didn't come to an agreement on a definition, but we understood what we were talking when we were talking to each other. And so if you have 57 definitions, you can actually work with it. As long as you're clear that every time David speaks, he's saying one thing. Every time Peter speaks or Michael speaks, they may be saying different things. And Jonty, he's off in his own over here. And he's completely right. And we all know that. But it's accepting that type of thing. So thank you. I apologize for that. I know there's actually one in Germany, and there's one out of, where's the other one out of? There's a couple of these documents out more as well.
Good. Okay.
Sorry.
Can I just say I would like please to meet the two speakers in the next session. Meanwhile, it's coffee time, and thank you again, Roger.
Thank you.